America, 1946. The war was over. The prisoners were going home, all except one. His name was Hans Himmler, a 24-year-old German mechanic held in a camp deep in Texas, while others longed for the ruins of their homeland. Hans refused to leave. To the U.S. Army, it made no sense. Why would a captured enemy soldier beg to stay in the land of his captors? They called him unstable. Others whispered that he'd fallen in love, but when his file vanished from military records, and decades later, a sealed report surfaced, a darker truth began to emerge. What America tried to hide wasn't madness or romance. It was something far more human and far more dangerous. This is the forgotten story of the German POW who refused to go home. April 1945. The guns had finally fallen silent. Across Europe, the echoes of war drifted away like smoke after a dying fire. Cities lay in ashes, men wandered through ruins searching for homes that no longer existed, and the world tried to remember what peace was supposed to feel like. But peace came with strange boundaries. In the heart of America, thousands of miles from the broken cities of Berlin and Dresden, barbed wire still marked the edges of another forgotten war. Behind it lived the prisoners, men who had once worn the Iron Cross and followed the Eagle banner across Europe. They were German soldiers, captured and shipped across the Atlantic to the land of their enemy. The camera pans across Camp Hearn, Texas. Wooden barracks stand beneath the hot sun, surrounded by dusty fields and endless fences. The air smells of sand, sweat, and coffee, not fear. Inside the camp, life moves slowly. A group of German prisoners shovel gravel under the watch of a lone American guard, his rifle resting lazily against the fence. In the distance, laughter drifts from the mess hall, men singing German folk songs as if trying to rebuild the world with melody alone. They were enemies, yes, but they were also farmers, teachers, fathers, and for the first time in years, they were alive. Among them was Hans Himmler, 24 years old, Luftwaffe mechanic. Captured in Italy during the collapse of the Reich, he had been shipped to Texas in 1944. Just another name on a long transport list, another soldier the world had forgotten. But there was something about him that stood out. While others cursed their fate, Hans adapted quickly, learning English from camp newspapers, helping guards repair broken equipment, sketching the American sky in a small, battered notebook. Some called him the Quiet One. Others said he was too calm for a man defeated. Even the camp commander noticed that German, he once told a lieutenant, he doesn't look like he's waiting to go home. He looks like he's already found one. Outside the fence, the small town of Hearn carried on as if the war were just a story told on the radio. Farmers drove past the camp with wagons full of cotton. Children waved to the prisoners, curious, unafraid, and little by little, a strange friendship began to grow between enemies separated by wire and language. The townsfolk traded food for handmade toys and carved wooden boxes. The Germans sang Christmas carols in December, and the locals came to listen through the fence. It was as if, on that dusty patch of Texas soil, the war had ended earlier than anywhere else. But not everyone believed the peace would last. Every few weeks, trucks arrived with new orders, men being transferred to ports, then shipped back to Europe. The repatriation process had begun. By summer 1946, most of the camp's population had already gone. The barracks were half empty, the air quieter, and soon, the soldiers began talking about home. What was left of it? For some, home meant wives they hadn't seen in years. For others, it meant rubble and silence. Hans listened but rarely spoke. When asked about returning to Germany, he only said Germany no longer exists. Not the one I remember. The other prisoners laughed. They thought he was joking, until the day the final orders arrived. One humid morning, a loudspeaker announcement broke the camp stillness. All remaining prisoners are to report for repatriation processing. Departure in 7 days. Cheers erupted across the yard. Men hugged, sung, wept. After years of captivity, they would finally step onto ships bound for home. But as the camp celebrated, one man stood apart near the fence line, eyes fixed on the horizon. Hans Himmler, the guard on duty, later recalled that he looked almost frightened, as if freedom itself scared him. In the days that followed, the barracks buzzed with farewells. Hans packed his few belongings, a notebook, a handmade wooden figure, and a small photograph of the Texas countryside. But when his name was called at the final roll call, he didn't move. He just stood there, silent. The officer repeated the name Himmler. Hans, step forward. Nothing. Finally, Hans replied quietly. In English, I'm not going. The officer frowned. What do you mean, you're not going? Everyone's going. "You're free." Hans looked down, then said the words that would haunt every man in that camp for years to come, "Then I'll stay a prisoner." The laughter around him stopped. Even the guards didn't know how to react. A German soldier, refusing to go home? In all the months of repatriation, no one had ever heard such a thing. At first, they thought it was a joke, then, a breakdown. But when Hans refused again, politely, calmly, and without hesitation, a message was sent to Washington, and what followed was the beginning of one of the strangest, most hidden stories of post-war America. The story of the German POW who refused to go home. The announcement of Hans Himmler's refusal spread through Camp Herne like wildfire. Within hours, everyone knew the quiet German mechanic had refused freedom. At first, his fellow prisoners laughed it off. "He's lost his mind," one said. "Too much sun, he doesn't want to see the ruins," another replied grimly. But by evening, the laughter had stopped. There was something unsettling about the way Hans moved through the camp, calm, composed, polite, as if he'd made peace with the decision that everyone else found unthinkable. The camp commandant, Major Robert Harlan, summoned him to his office. The small room smelled of tobacco and sweat. Harlan leaned back in his chair, staring at the young German in front of him. "Himmler," he said slowly, "you understand what you're saying, right? You're free. You can go home. Why would you want to stay?" Hans nodded once. "Yes, sir. I understand." "Then explain yourself." Hans hesitated, his English careful, deliberate. "Because I have no home to go to." Major Harlan frowned. "You have family, don't you?" "Once," Hans said softly. "A mother in Dresden. A sister near Hamburg. But Dresden is gone. Hamburg burned. I received letters before the bombings. After that, nothing." He looked up, his pale blue eye steady. "If I go back, I go to ghosts." The major studied him in silence. There had been strange requests before, prisoners asking for extra time to finish work, some even requesting to emigrate later, but this was different. This man wasn't asking for a delay. He was asking to stay a prisoner. "That's not how this works, son," Harlan said finally. "War's over. You go home. Orders are orders." Hans smiled faintly. "Maybe the war is over for you, Major. For me, it's still trying to find an ending." The next few days turned surreal. The others boarded the trucks that would take them to the ships. Hans watched from the fence as they left, waving, shouting farewells, faces filled with joy and fear. When the last truck disappeared beyond the horizon, he turned back toward the empty barracks. A camp built for thousands now held one man. The silence was overwhelming. The U.S. Army didn't know what to do with him. A report was filed to the War Department titled "Subject POW Himmler. Hans refuses repatriation to Germany." Washington responded with confusion. No protocol existed for a man who refused his own freedom. The Geneva Convention required the return of prisoners, but it didn't forbid them from staying, as long as the host country agreed. So the government's initial response was simple: hold him for observation. Weeks passed. The guards treated Hans like a curiosity, the last prisoner of a war that had already ended. He swept the campgrounds, tended the gardens, repaired machinery. When asked why he stayed, he gave the same quiet answer every time: "Because here, I am no one's enemy." But there was another layer, something deeper. Hans had begun spending time in the nearby town of Herne, under guard supervision. He helped repair tractors for local farmers, fixed radios, and even volunteered at the church. That's where he met Eleanor James, a 27-year-old widow whose husband had died in Europe, fighting Germans. At first, she could barely look at him. The irony was unbearable, but Hans was different from what she'd imagined a German soldier to be. He spoke softly, avoided arguments, and worked with quiet discipline. Over time, her bitterness began to fade, replaced by curiosity. One afternoon, while repairing a broken church bell, Eleanor asked him, "How can you stay here, among people who must hate you?" Hans paused, his hands covered in grease. "Maybe that's why I stay. So they can learn not to." Their friendship drew whispers from the townsfolk. A German prisoner and an American widow. It was scandalous. Some called it treason, others called it love. But for Hans, it wasn't about romance, at least, not at first. It was about belonging. For the first time since the war began, he felt seen as a man, not a uniform. Eleanor saw the same. Behind the accent and the uniform number was a man rebuilding himself from ashes, like everyone else in 1946. Meanwhile, newspapers caught wind of the strange story. A headline in the Houston Chronicle read, "German POW refuses repatriation. chooses life in captivity over freedom. The story spread like wildfire, reaching even Washington. Public reaction was divided. Some saw Hans as a symbol of post-war healing, proof that reconciliation was possible. Others saw danger, a Nazi sympathizer hiding behind a soft face. Congressmen demanded to know why a German soldier was being kept on U.S. soil after the war. The War Department panicked. What had seemed like a harmless anomaly was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare. A secret order was sent to Fort Sam Houston, where Hans was quietly transferred for evaluation. He was interrogated by Army intelligence officers who suspected him of espionage or propaganda intent. "Who are you working for?" one officer demanded. "No one," Hans replied calmly. "I just don't want to go home." "That's not a reason." "That's a lie." "Then maybe I'm lying to myself," Hans said softly. The interrogators left frustrated. Psychologists declared him emotionally stable but ideologically disillusioned. In simple terms, a man without a country. Back at Fort Sam Houston, Hans became a ghost in uniform. He repaired jeeps, translated documents, and quietly assisted camp doctors. He never raised his voice, never caused trouble, but his presence unsettled the brass. Because every time they looked at him, they saw the one thing they couldn't explain: a German who didn't want to stop being their prisoner. Then, one morning, an officer arrived with sealed orders. Hans was summoned to the command office, where a colonel stood waiting with a stern face and a file in hand. "Emler, your case has reached Washington. The War Department has decided. You will be repatriated by force if necessary." Hans said nothing for a long time. Finally, he stood, saluted, and said quietly, "Then, Colonel, you may have to arrest your most obedient prisoner." That night, he disappeared. By the time guards checked his barracks, the bed was cold. The fence had been cut near the east perimeter. Search teams were sent out at dawn, dogs, jeeps, patrols. But Hans Himmler had vanished into the vast fields of Texas. For days, nothing. Then, a week later, a farmer outside Hearne reported a strange visitor. A young man with a foreign accent who offered to repair his windmill in exchange for food. By the time investigators arrived, the man was gone. Only the windmill stood, fixed, turning perfectly in the breeze. Months later, locals whispered about sightings: a tall man with light hair working odd jobs across rural Texas. Always alone, always polite, never staying in one place too long. Some said he found a new life under a false name. Others said he joined a monastery. A few believed he died in the desert, trying to escape the ghosts of two worlds that no longer wanted him. But one thing was certain: Hans Himmler had become more than a man. He had become a question: what happens when a soldier loses his war, his country, and his purpose, but finds his humanity among his former enemies? The U.S. government quietly sealed his file in 1947. The documents were classified. The case never mentioned again, at least not publicly, because decades later, in a dusty archive in Austin, Texas, someone would stumble upon the file labeled H. Himmler, Enemy Alien Special Custody Case, and inside it, one note scrawled by a U.S. officer in pencil: "The German who refused to go home may still be here." The war was history now. The camps were empty fields, the watchtowers dismantled, the barbed wire rolled away. But one figure remained behind: Hans Himmler, working quietly in the shade of a broken barn, mending tractors and old engines for the local farmers. He wore no uniform now, just a faded shirt and an old cap. But the way he moved, precise, disciplined, silent, still betrayed the soldier inside him. The locals knew him only as that German boy. He fixed their machines, repaired fences, and never charged more than a few dollars. Children would watch him work, fascinated by his strange accent and the way he'd hum old songs under his breath. They didn't know that Hans had once been part of the army that destroyed their sons. And Hans never told them. One morning, a letter arrived at the small farm where he lived. It was from the U.S. Department of War. He stared at the seal on the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside were just a few lines: "Your stay is unauthorized. You are to report immediately for repatriation." His hands trembled. The war had ended 2 years ago, but the ghosts of that war had finally caught up with him. The farmer's wife, Margaret, found him sitting on the porch, staring at the fields. "You could run," she said softly. "There's nowhere left to run," he replied. That night, he left a note on the kitchen table. Margaret found it the next morning, next to his army dog tags in a photograph, a black and white image of a young woman smiling, holding a baby. On the back, in German, it read: "Ich bin schuld. I am guilty." And no one ever saw Hans Himmler again. Some said he went to Mexico. Others believed he turned himself in quietly, disappearing into the machinery of post-war bureaucracy. But years later, an American archivist at Fort Sam Houston stumbled upon a sealed folder marked confidential, POW case for 197. Inside was a memo, subject refused repatriation citing moral responsibility, claimed knowledge of U.S. experimentation on POW labor, ordered silence. File closed. Hans hadn't stayed for love. He had stayed because he'd seen something. Something America wanted forgotten. During his time in the camp, certain POWs were assigned to special projects, building experimental equipment, testing materials, and in some cases, working on biological research under U.S. supervision. Hans had been one of them. And when he realized the truth, that he and his fellow prisoners were being used as expendable tools, he refused to be part of it. That's why he stayed. Not to live freely, but to carry the guilt, to bear witness in silence. Today, nothing remains of Camp Hearn but a few concrete foundations and the rusted skeleton of a water tower. Yet, locals still tell stories of a quiet German mechanic who lived among them for years, fixing machines, helping neighbors, and disappearing without a trace, somewhere in the Texas archives. His name still exists on a yellowing document marked not returned, a man who chose guilt over freedom, silence over safety, truth over home. History remembers battles and generals, but it forgets the quiet ones, the men who fought no wars, who carried no flags, yet bore the heaviest burden of all. Hans Himmler's story isn't about loyalty or betrayal. It's about what happens when war ends, but conscience doesn't, and maybe, somewhere, that's the truest victory a soldier can ever have.